this talk is about the importance of lineage and specifically the Kagyu lineage. And the importance of lineage is that it keeps the teachings pure. This keeps things that weren't originally in the teachings out of the teachings. And we are students of the Karmapa, and therefore we are in the Kagyu lineage. And that means sometimes it's been translated or interpreted as meaning the practice lineage. Sometimes it's been the oral lineage, because originally it was passed on from teacher to student orally. And also the realization lineage, and that is because if you practice, you will attain realization. So the Buddha taught three different vehicles: Mahayana, Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. And the Vajrayana teachings, it is said the world was not ready for most of them. And it was the Dakinis that kept these teachings first. And then came Tilopa, at least in terms of the Kagyu lineage. There were other great Maha cities in India that also had this experience. But for the Kagyus, the lineage starts with Tilopa, who again is an Indian master. And Tilopa was practicing Hinayana and Mahayana, and he attained siddhi or accomplishment through these practices. And so as a result of that siddhi, he went to Akanisha, which is a, Rinpoche described it as, quote, the highest realm of Vajradhara, the enlightened sphere of the Dharmakaya Vajradhatu. And that's where the Dakinis that were keeping these Vajrayana teachings reside. So he received these Vajrayana teachings from the Dakinis there and brought them back to the human realm. Now, as a result of this, Tilopa said to Naropa, his main student, I have no human guru. So another way of saying that is that his root guru was Vajradhara. And if you go back and or just recall the Mahamudra lineage supplication, it starts with Vajradhara, Dorje Chang in the Tibetan version of that. And so that's why it starts with Vajradhara, because that's where that was Tilopa's guru, his root guru. And Rinpoche describes the Dharmakaya Vajradhara as the wisdom that pervades and is the essence of all things. So this is the wisdom that pervades all things. This is the essence of all things. And quite honestly, in Vajrayana, the goal is not to attain Buddhahood, but it is to attain the state of Vajradhara, to experience and know the wisdom that pervades everything, to know the essence of all things. And it is said that if you know that essence, if you know one, you know all. So the specialty of the Kagyu tradition are the Mahamudra teachings. And this is where the Mahamudra teachings begin with Tilopa. Needless to say, the other teachings, the Hinayana and the Mahayana, were widely available in India at that time, as well as in Tibet. But the Mahamudra teachings were not available in Tibet. So his main student, Tilopa's main student, was Naropa. And Naropa, he was a Pandita at Nalanda University in India, which was a great center of learning. I visited the ruin a few years ago. It's not that far from Bodh Gaya. And it covered a very large area. Part of it had been excavated and was open to the public. Most of it cannot be excavated because there's a town on top of the ruins. But Pandita means that he was a scholar. He knew the teachings very, very well. And the tradition at Nalanda was they had 4 main gates into the place, and that they would place panditas at each of these 4 gates. And if someone wanted to enter, he would debate them, the pandita. Kind of determine, are they really suitable to enter? So the very fact that this was part of his duties showed that he was in high standing at the university. I think that they had as many as 10,000 people there living at the university when it was at its peak. So anyway, one day he was there at the gate and he was reading. And in Rinpoche's words, and I've heard this from other sources too, an old toothless woman appeared while he was reading at the gate. And she asks, "Do you understand the words you are reading?" And he says, "Well, yes, of course." And so she becomes overjoyed and starts dancing. And so then she says, oh, excuse me, she doesn't ask another question. He says this, not only do I um, I think I said that wrong. Oh yeah, he says, not only that, but I understand the meaning of the words. And at that point, her demeanor changes completely, and she gets angry. Then she said, "You lie and you shouldn't lie." And of course, that really upset Naropa. And so she tells him that you need to see Tilopa. And when he heard that word, Tilopa, an intense devotion arose in Naropa, and he had this irresistible desire to find him. Now, this is the way Vajrayana is, and that is that the old woman was actually Vajrayogini. And you might say that she was there to kind of push him to go further than he would have on his own. And there are a lot of stories like this in Tibetan Buddhism, where these deities appear in a form that you wouldn't readily recognize. And as a result of that interaction, they encourage the practitioner to go further than they would on their own. So Naropa then goes on a search for Tilopa. And in Rinpoche's words, he goes through many, quote, extremely unpleasant and bizarre experiences, unquote, before he could finally see Tilopa. And this happened. Tilopa created these situations in order to purify Naropa's karma and for him to accumulate merit, and also for him to test Naropa. Now, I'm going to put a little aside here because when I was a prison chaplain, I had one inmate there that came to my classes diligently. And then he read a biography, probably Milarepa's biography. And after that, he really cooled down in his enthusiasm because he was afraid I was going to do the same thing to him as Marpa did to Milarepa. Well, I'm not a Marpa, I'm not a Milarepa, I'm not a Tilopa, I'm not a Naropa. I'm not going to do that to you. I'm not able to. If I could, and I thought you were an excellent student, I might. But at this point, I'm not able to do that because I can't see your karma and so on and so forth. And if you think about it, I try to be like Khenpo Karta Rinpoche, and he was a very gentle, kind, peaceful guru. That's who I try to be like. So don't let talking about this scare you. So, in other words, what he made Naropa go through were blessings in disguise. So he did now find Tilopa, and more unpleasant experiences happened. And this kept on going. Finally, years later, and Naropa has been accompanying Tilopa, and the story that I heard, this wasn't in this transcript of Rinpoche's, but Tilopa had a servant in the kitchen that fixed meals and so forth. And so Tilopa had given the servant the instructions that if Naropa comes into the kitchen, beat him. And so then Tilopa told Naropa later, would you go into the kitchen and get me some food? Which Naropa gladly did, cheerfully did, went in there and got beaten by the cook, chased out. And so then Naropa comes out of the kitchen and goes right to Tilopa, and Tilopa takes off his sandals and hit him on the head. And this part was in the book. And to quote Rinpoche, when he got hit on the head with a sandal, quote, his mind was propelled into a state of meditation. And when he arose from that meditation, his mind was exactly the same as the mind of Tilopa. So at this point, Naropa had the same realization as Tilopa. And Naropa realized that all of his obstacles and hardships were actually very beneficial for him. So what Rinpoche says to kind of conclude this is that all the obstacles and hardships that we face with Dharma practice are beneficial. That we're accumulating merit, the more difficulty it is, that we experience, the more merit we accumulate, and the more of our karma we purify. And we have to do both. We have to purify our karma, and we have to accumulate merit. And he says, and if we don't have many obstacles, then we can do prostrations, nyungne, and other practices that make offerings and purify our merit, our karma, and accumulate merit. And I'm going to give a little plug to my center. And when we are passed through this present disease, we will be offering nyungne here at my center again. So then the next person in the lineage who became Naropa's main student is Marpa. And Marpa is the first Tibetan in this lineage here, the Mahamudra lineage, the Kagyu lineage. And it is primarily the Mahamudra teachings that are being passed on at this point. So Marpa was an angry young man. He was angry at everybody and everything. And basically everybody hated him in the area because he was so difficult to be around. And his parents were actually worried that he would be killed because he was so angry. And so they said that you need to enter the Dharma, and that'll help tame your mind and you'll behave better. Well, Marpa had a better idea, and that is, he said, I'll study the Dharma, and what I'm going to do is that there are people that have around this area that have been going to India, receiving teachings, coming back, and they become rich and famous. So I'll go to India and then become rich and famous when I get back. So that was the motivation he had to practice Dharma, was I'll become rich and famous. Now, Marpa was very fortunate because the trip to India at that time was extremely dangerous. I had heard from Tai Situ Rinpoche that only 1 in 30 Tibetans who went to India returned alive home. And the refugees that fled Tibet and went to India, many of them suffered similar fates because of the disease, if nothing else. That they're 2 very, very different climates, and that they would be susceptible to diseases that did not exist in India. And then, of course, there were bandits, just plain difficulties, and wild animals that, like tigers. And so it was a very difficult journey and a dangerous journey. But Marpa was able to do this successfully and find Marpa without any huge difficulties. And to quote Rinpoche, after meeting Marpa, quote, he became totally engulfed with intelligence, compassion, devotion, and diligence. 4 very good qualities. And so Naropa had a tremendous positive influence on him, that his hardness of his character, his anger, were transmuted into inner strength and diligence. And diligence is defined as joyful exertion. And it was through practice that he transmuted the anger into strength and joyful exertion. So Rinpoche goes on to emphasize that holding the lineage of one's teacher means more than intellectual understanding. It means practicing till qualities arise. Going back to Naropa, it means practicing till you understand not only the words, but the meaning of the words. So Marpa went back to Tibet and he made 2 more trips to India. He spent a total of 17 years in India. And finally, in the last trip, he couldn't find Naropa. Naropa had become so realized, you might say, he disappeared. So what Marpa did is he prayed and prayed and prayed that he would meet Naropa. And eventually he saw a footprint of Naropa's. And he prayed even more. And then after that, he saw the mandala of Havajra, which is Naropa's yidam. And that made him pray even more intensely. And then finally, Naropa appeared. And this is not in Rinpoche's book, and I'm not sure where I read this. I'm pretty sure it was in a biography of Marpa. And so he had taken gold to offer to Naropa. And and it probably was fine gold dust. And so he offered this to Naropa. Naropa took it and just tossed it into the air and said, "My whole world is golden. I have no need for this." And then Naropa appointed Marpa to be his representative in Tibet. And so then Marpa returns home from his final trip. And here is a short, some information from a teaching the Karmapa gave about Marpa. That he studied also with Maitripa, who was very famous in India at that time, as well as Naropa. And he studied with other masters as well. It wasn't just that Naropa was his only teacher or guru. Naropa predicted to Marpa that his disciples would be greater than their teachers and that their students would be even more realized. So that the lineage would be like a river of ever increasing flow. So now Marpa's main student is Milarepa. And Milarepa's story, I like to tell this story to inmates because an inmate frequently they feel like they are the lowest and the low and are very bad and have very low self-images and feel they can't accomplish much. So, in his last trip to India, Marpa mentioned to Naropa that he had a student named Milarepa. And the Ropa's response was, quote, "The illuminator of the darkness in the northern realm is like the sun shining brightly on a mountain covered with snow. I pay homage to the one called Delightful to Hear," which is Milarepa's personal name. So that was a prediction of Naropa's that Milarepa would be Marpa's main student, and he would be a great influence in Tibet on Buddhism. So this is Milarepa's story, that he was born into a wealthy family, and his father died. And after that, there was an aunt and uncle that basically took over their land and property and house. That Milarepa's mother could not stop this from happening. And so his mother became very bitter and angry. And Milarepa, I'm not sure how old he was, but she told him that he had to avenge the family. And so he goes and learns black magic. And let's just put it this way. There were a lot of non-Buddhist traditions in Tibet at the time. The main one is what's called Bon. I'm not sure if this black magic was related to a particular type of Bon or if it was independent from Bon. I've never really asked that question or received an answer. But anyway, he learned black magic and black magic that works. And so the aunt and uncle are having a wedding celebration in the house that used to be Milarepa's and his parents. And through black magic, Milarepa causes the house to collapse, and 35 people, the guests, are killed. The aunt and uncle are not killed. So he killed 35 people, but he did not accomplish the vengeance that his mother wanted him to. Well, now Milarepa starts thinking back on this and develops some regret, worried about when he dies, he will go to a very bad place like hell. And so he decides that he has to purify his karma. And so he meets Marpa. Marpa, through his realization, understands Milarepa's karma, and he refuses to give the teachings, but makes Milarepa do all kinds of things that really cause him to almost get to the point of giving up. The classic story is about Milarepa's tower, where he told Milarepa to build him a 9-story tower. And of course, out of rock. That's what they used back then. And so he gathered the rock together and then started building it exactly where Marpa told him to build it. And after he got a really good part of the tower built, Marpa came out and said, looked it over and said, "Why are you building it here? I told you to build it over there and tear it down and put all the rocks back where you found it, and then build it over there." And he did that. And I'm not sure how many times he had to tear it down and build it in a new place. But literally, Milarepa got to the point where he was contemplating suicide because he wasn't getting the teachings, and it seemed like he wasn't getting anywhere with the tower either. And so he did eventually get the tower built, and then Marpa gave him teachings. And the thing was that these actions of his, and there were many others, it purified his karma, it increased his merit. And so when he did give him to the teachings, it was like pouring water from a pitcher into a glass. That Milarepa understood the teachings, he practiced the teachings, and he attained realization. And the stories in that syllabus that I gave you, there are 2 books there about Milarepa. They make very interesting reading. And Milarepa spent from this time on much of his life living in caves with very, very little in the way of possessions. It was the material world that caused him to kill 35 people, and he became an extreme renunciate. One of the stories about him is that he was meditating and practicing alone in a cave, and a band of robbers came across him and went into the cave and went through all his possessions looking for something to steal. And there was nothing for them to take that they wanted. And so they left. And later in the day, one of the robbers came back and felt so sorry for Milarepa that he gave him something. So Milarepa reached a very high level of realization. And his main student is Gampopa. And so this is the story about Gampopa. Gampopa was a very happily married man and was a doctor of Tibetan medicine. And this is kind of reminiscent of today. His wife became terminally ill, and he told her, "There's really nothing I can do to cure you. You're not going to get better." But she wouldn't die. She wouldn't let go. And so he asked her, "Well, why won't you let go?" And she says, "I'm so in love with you. I know that after I die, you will remarry because you're such a handsome, desirable man." And so then he says, "Well, what can I do to help you let go?" And she says, "Promise me that you will become a monk." And so he does, and she dies. So he goes to a Kadampa monastery, becomes a monk, and studies in the Kadampa tradition. And the Kadampa tradition at that time was a separate lineage. It has since become part of the 4 main lineages in Tibetan Buddhism. And the 7 points of mind training, which many of you are familiar with, that comes from the Kadampa tradition. Their style of teaching tended to be through the use of slogans. And so there are a lot of collections of slogans that come from the Karmapa tradition, but the 7 points of mind training is the one that we are most familiar with. So he became a very respected teacher. Now, Milarepa had supercognition, And he becomes aware that it's time for Karmapa to become his student and to be tamed. And so what Milarepa does is he emanates 3 beggars outside of Karmapa's window in the cabin that he is in. And so these 3 beggars that are emanations of Milarepa are talking, and one of them mentions Milarepa's name. And then this intense devotion arises within Karmapa, much like it arose in Naropa for Tilopa. And he becomes obsessed with meeting Milarepa. And it was not an easy journey, you might say, to find Milarepa. He finally did, and became Milarepa's student, received his instructions, practiced them, and in Rinpoche's word, attained the 10th Bhumi level of realization. And that is about as close as you can get to becoming fully enlightened Buddha as you can. The Karmapa is considered to be manifesting like a 10th Bhumi Bodhisattva. Bhumi means level. So what Karmapa did then is he joined the Mahamudra teachings and tradition with the monastic tradition and the Mahayana teachings of the Kadampa tradition. And it is at this point where the Kagyu lineage really starts taking the form that we are familiar with. None of these others in the lineage that I've talked about were monastics. They were yogis. Now, on top of that, Marpa had 51,600 students. Milarepa had a few students, Marpa had a few students, Naropa had a few students, Tilopa had a few students, but Karmapa had a huge number of students at a time where if you wanted to come and see him and receive teachings from him, that would be like you're walking, or maybe if you were lucky, you could ride a horse. So it was a great difficulty that these people would come and become his students. Karmapa, his fame spread throughout Tibet. So this is what was meant by that the students would have higher realization than the teachers, and it wasn't so much that their realization was greater, but their influence was greater. They led to more and more and more people receiving the teachings and experiencing realization. So to go on here, his main student was Karmapa, the first Karmapa, Dusum Khenpa. And so just a few stories about Dusum Khenpa. Dusum Khenpa means knower of the 3 times. He knew his past, he knew his present life, and he knew his future lives. And he was from Kham, Kham, Khenpo Karta Rinpoche, Trungpa Rinpoche, and many of the Kagyu masters that we're familiar with came from Kham. And people from Kham, or at least men from Kham, are called Kampas. Rinpoche told the story of the 3 men from Kham, And so there was the first Karmapa, who was not known as Dusum Khenpa. Rinpoche said he was called Kampa Whitehead. I don't know what the Tibetan word for that is, but in the transcript, he just says Whitehead. Karpo was white. And it was because he was prematurely gray. And then there was another Kampa Dorgal, and a third Kampa Tsultrim Shogom. And all three of them had attained siddhi, and as a result, they could do things that ordinary people could not do. And they also behaved a little bit bizarrely. All three were monks. And so they wanted to perform a Vajrayogini sok. And what was traditional then with a Vajrayogini sok was to offer beer, Tibetan beer. And they got permission from Gampopa to do this sok, and he said each of them could have 3 cups of beer, and that meant drinking it at the Vajrayogini sok. The idea with these very advanced practitioners and practice is that even beer is considered pure, and during the sok you can drink it. They don't do that at KTD. You don't drink alcohol. But anyway, that's what was done here. And so they went out to do this sok out in the open. And they could have, they wanted to brew some tea. And so they needed water, and they needed fire, and they needed firewood. And so these men were siddhis, or siddhas rather, attained siddhi. And so the first Karmapa, he went and got water and picked it up with a net and brought it back. The Kampa Dorgal, he was in charge of getting the firewood. And what he did is he had a sling. And this sling, I've seen them when I've been to Tibet. They're kind of like the sling that the Christians talk about David having and slaying Goliath with. And, you'd put a rock in it and go around like this. And so he was throwing these rocks at the firewood, hurting it, and got it to go up to where they wanted the fire. And then Karmapa Tsultrim Shogum, he could have started the fire in the ordinary way, but he spread out his hands. You can see me, and fire and wind shot through the fingertips and started the fire. So this is how siddhas or mahasiddhas behave. And so they finished the sok, drank the beer, and then were just overjoyed with, you might say, devotion, and they sang and danced there. And then they came back to the monastery singing and dancing, and the discipline master saw this, and he completely disapproved of it, and he said, "You've got to get out of here in the morning. I'm kicking you out. You're not behaving properly for monks." And so they left in the morning. And then Gampopa was feeling kind of strange at that time, and he asked his attendant to go outside and look, see what was going on. And here I'm going to quote Rinpoche in this transcript. "All the birds who normally lived around the monastery were flying down the mountain, going away. All the trees were falling down the mountainside. The wind was also blowing downward off the top of the mountain with a large whooshing sound. He also saw the 3 Kampas prostrating down the mountain." So Popa didn't like this, and he went out there to try to find them. Eventually he did. And what he did then was he sang what would be called a doha to them, explaining to them that they were all disciples of the Buddha, and they had this connection. They were all disciples of the Buddha at the time of the Buddha, and they have this karmic connection, and that they have to come back up to the monastery. And the doha goes on for quite a long time. And then when he finishes, the three men from the three Kampas, they start dancing and singing their own song about how they are coming back up. And they left footprints in the rock, and so did Gampopa. And Rinpoche says you can still see these footprints today. So the three men lived in solitary retreat huts after that. So the Kampa, white hair, he became Dusum Kempa. And he then, the first Karmapa, was the one that started the Kagyu lineage as we now know it, and has been head of the Kagyu lineage ever since. And it is the first Karmapa. When he died, the second Karmapa was identified as his rebirth, and that was the first time in Tibetan Buddhism that this had ever been done. And soon other great masters were being identified as the rebirth, the kids as a rebirth of these great masters. So the first Karmapa started this. And I think that's a good place to end.